My name is Anthony Cox. I'm the Deputy Director for the Environment Directorate here at the OECD, and welcome to today's Green Talk Live, which is about the topic of coastal adaptation to sea level rise. Now, sea level rise is one of the major challenges that's been identified in the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees. It's almost certain that we will experience at least 1 metre of sea level rise, with some models estimating that this will happen sometime in the next 80 years. And this will have serious implications for damage to infrastructure, loss of land and displacement of communities around our coastlines. And even if we succeed in limiting global warming temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, we already have a large amount of adaptation locked in, and this will require a massive amount of infrastructure to achieve, and sea levels will inevitably continue to rise for centuries to come. So this sea level rise issue is creating really difficult choices for those affected by coastal change. If we fail to adapt or fail to address the barriers today, we really are going to be at risk of locking in very dysfunctional outcomes, making it more expensive and disruptive to adapt further down the road. Now, the OECD has been working on this issue for some years. We've been working on adaptation, supporting governments in their efforts to address the impacts of climate change. In the past, we've focused very much on making the economic case for adaptation, focusing on getting planning right and on improving monitoring and evaluation efforts. In recent years, we've switched our focus somewhat to shift more from the planning to the implementation. And this is because countries are becoming more and more advanced and sophisticated in their attempts to adapt to climate impacts. So today's report is very much focused around how governments are adapting to the challenges associated with sea level rise. And we've got two experts who have prepared the report that has been released today. It's called Responding to Rising Seas, OECD Country Approaches to Tackling Coastal Risks. You can download it from the OECD website. And these two experts have prepared this report and are going to be presenting to you today. First of all, I'd introduce Lisa Danielson, who is a policy analyst in the Environment Directorate at the OECD here, with our climate adaptation team, and she's been leading this work. And also joining us online, co-presenting with Lisa, is Sandy Bisaro, who is from the Global Climate Forum in Berlin. And Sandy has more than a decade experience in climate vulnerability and adaptation research in Europe, Africa, and Asia. So we have around 20 to 25 minutes of presentation from Lisa and Sandy, and afterwards there'll be roughly half an hour for questions. So for those of you who are online today, you can send your questions at any time during the talk to the questions moderator section of the chat section on your WebEx screen, and I will convey them to Lisa and Sandy. So this is your chance to dig deeper into this topic and to quiz our experts. And for those of you in the room, we'll take questions from the floor as well, and we'll mix it up as we go through the discussion period. So without further ado, I'd ask Lisa to kick off, and then you'll have a tag team with Sandy, and off you go.
Thank you, Anthony, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for listening in today and for us having the opportunity to share our findings from this report, which Anthony said is being released today. So to start, I'm going to take you through the challenge of coastal adaptation. Then Sandy will talk about the future costs of sea level rise as well as the policy implications. Then I'll go through what OECD countries are currently doing to address coastal risk. And finally, we're going to talk about what else can be done. So why are we focusing on coastal adaptation? As Anthony said, sea level rise is getting worse, and it's going to increase the frequency of both nuisance and extreme flooding, as well as beach and cliff erosion, which will damage coastal properties and infrastructure. And our hypothesis for this project is that current institutional arrangements are not well equipped to deal with rising coastal risks. So for example, increasing exposure and hazards will make it more expensive to protect all properties to the standards today, which will have financial implications for different levels of government as well as for individuals. And this project was demand-driven, so sea level rise is a relatively new policy area, and it's clear that impacts are already being felt and will get worse, so our member countries really wanted to know how others were tackling this issue. So to go through the questions we want to understand for this project first, we wanted to understand the problem. So we asked, what's the potential extent of sea level rise damages? For this, the Global Climate Forum did new modeling, which Sandy will explain, as well as we looked at why aren't risks internalized into current decisions on the coast. We also wanted to know what are OECD countries doing now. So for this, we did a scan of adaptation plans and other gray literature, as well as did a series of interviews and a round of reviews with OECD countries. And finally, we wanted to know what works. So what aspects of the national context actually support or hinder adaptation at the local level? And for this, we did 4 detailed case studies. We looked at the UK, Canada, Germany, New Zealand. And finally, bringing everything together, what are the elements of an effective response going forward? So I'm going to spend a short amount of time explaining the challenge of sea level rise. So as a background, when we refer to coastal adaptation, usually we mean measures that directly reduce coastal risks. So for existing property, that's generally protect, which is stopping water from coming in. That can be done by either building hard infrastructure like seawalls and dikes. It can also be done through nature-based solutions. So a common one is beach nourishment, which is adding more sand to existing dunes. It can also be done through accommodation, which means reducing vulnerability. So this could be things like property level measures, such as flood-proofing your basement, investing in more sandbags, raising your house, or planned retreat, which is actually moving back from the water. There's also options for areas where you don't yet have development, and the most recommended option is, of course, avoid, which is don't build in a risky area in the first place. So in theory, this is what you do for coastal adaptation, but in practice, it's not really quite this black and white or this simple. And we have evidence that a problem is persisting. So first, we're seeing that across the world, new developments are still happening in at-risky areas. They're being built in the wrong location and oftentimes with the wrong construction materials for the risks they'll soon face. As well as for existing development, in general, there's an underinvestment in coastal adaptation. And when we do invest, it's often in hard protection, so seawalls and dikes, and not enough use of other options that might make more economic or environmental sense. So this is a bit of an extreme example, but this is a homeowner in New Zealand who took it upon himself to build a seawall to protect his own property because the local council wasn't able to invest the estimated $18 million to fortify the coastline. And so while he prevented flooding in his own home, he caused erosion for his neighbors, and as you can see, it's probably not the most efficient solution. So why do we see these problems persisting? And why aren't we adapting efficiently? So first, sea level rise by itself is actually not a risk. If waves get higher, crash against an empty cliff, and that cliff erodes, that's not a problem. The problem comes from exposure. And exposure is when an asset is located in a hazard-prone area. So the extent to sea level rise damage depends on the location and the value of assets. And the location and value of assets depends on cumulative decisions, which are made by property owners, property developments, local governments, and national governments. And there's barriers that's preventing all these actors from taking sea level rise risks into consideration when they make decisions that increase exposure. So first, there's awareness gaps about the level and trend of risks. So this can be due to lack of information about risks, about cognitive barriers to actually understanding your risk, and existing policies. For example, publicly subsidized flood insurance can lower premium prices and then distort the price signal for risk. It can also come from misaligned incentives for risk reduction. So there's often a misalignment between who pays for coastal protection and who bears the cost for damages after an event occurs. So going back to the issue of insurance, a homeowner is far less likely to invest in protecting his own property if he doesn't have any financial incentive to do so. Another example is that local governments are often responsible for granting permits for development on the coast and benefit from the associated increased economic activity from that development, but they're often not responsible for disaster compensation after an event. And finally, there's political economy obstacles, which is coastal adaptation policies can reduce the value of an asset which can be a strong point of friction, as decisions that impact people's homes are generally very politically difficult. I'm now going to pass the floor to Sandy, who's going to talk us through the costs of increasing risk.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Thanks very much. What I'm going to do now is provide an overview of some of the work done at GCF, at the Global Climate Forum, by colleagues as well as others that Lisa mentioned at the outset. So this provides an overview really of sea level rise over the course of the 21st century and associated uncertainties to that, and then translates these scenarios into the economic costs of sea level rise based on a global model, the DEVA model, which calculates economic costs based on expected flood damages. And then we've done some work looking at the potential of adaptation, mainly a protection measure to reduce the costs of sea level rise through adaptation at the global level. And finally, I'd like to present a little bit of, present some work that we've done on a kind of robust analysis of the places globally where adaptation has an economic rationale across various different sea level rise and socioeconomic scenarios that we're dealing with. So if we move to the next slide, this gives a start to this global overview that I've just described. So here what you see is a picture of sea level rise scenarios over the course of the 21st century. You see depicted there in the green and blue bands sea level rise scenarios based on the most recent RCP, representative concentration pathways from the last IPCC report. And then we see that, as mentioned in the introduction, we have potential sea level rise within the next 80 years, going up to 1.3 meters in the high-end scenarios, but a range of values where we're committed to some sea level rise, but where that could be lower. What you see at the very top, the red band, is to illustrate that actually that range of 0.3 meters sea level rise to 1.3 by the end of the century doesn't represent the kind of the only possible futures for sea level rise, but there's also still a sort of fat tail risk of extremely high sea level rise, mainly due to uncertainties in Antarctic ice sheets. And so some of the modeling work that I'm going to show, we've done also using the implications of very high-end sea level rise, where we can see something on the order of up to 2 meters by the end of the century. If you go to the next slide, here what we see now is a translation of those different sea level rise scenarios into economic costs, so damages. What you see on the top row of the figure is the expected flood damages calculated for different sea level rise scenarios without any adaptation. And what we see here is kind of the respectively lowest and highest exposure socioeconomic scenarios, so SSP3 and SSP5, where we have on one hand lower GDP growth on the left-hand side and lower exposed assets in the coastal zone, and on the right-hand side sort of business as usual fossil fueled economic growth and higher asset exposure in the coastal zone. What you see is that socioeconomic scenarios do drive the expected damages of flooding under sea level rise, but that in both cases, without adaptation, these impacts are very substantial. So we see these are annual GDP damages on the order of trillions of dollars a year, and up to 4% annual world GDP by the end of the century without adaptation. The bottom row of this picture shows the potential that adaptation has globally. So again, across different socioeconomic scenarios and all sea level rise scenarios, adaptation reduces the expected flood damages by around 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. So there's a significant benefit from starting to think about adaptation now. If you go to the next slide, there's another part of this story in terms of the global picture of adaptation, which presents some challenges, and that's of course the scale of funding needs for realizing this adaptation that I've just shown, realizing those benefits in terms of reduced expected or reduced flood damages. And here, this picture shows the investment needs for adaptation across different socioeconomic scenarios. What we see here is that that actually sea level rise, and you see that with from 2050 in each of the different socioeconomic scenarios, we see that high end or higher sea level rise leads to much higher adaptation costs. And so for high end sea level rise, we can see up to $70 billion annually required globally to pursue an adaptation strategy. We see the actually lower or slower end, so lower sea level rise, slower sea level rise also produces substantial costs on the order of $20 billion annually by the end of the century, but these are significantly lower. Another point to make here is that actually we see that the investment needs for adaptation are similar up until about 2050, where then we see a strong divergence between high-end sea level rise and low-end sea level rise in terms of investment needs, and this provides an argument for mitigation adaptation as complementary responses. We need to be thinking about both responses to climate change, despite the fact we can realize many benefits from adapting. There's also an argument, clearly a strong argument to be made for upfront mitigation action. If you go to the next slide, please. Yes. So could we have the next slide? Great. So this now this picture shows a map of the world clearly, and this is innovative analysis conducted by colleagues at the Global Climate Forum that tries to now assess or kind of address some of the uncertainties that I've shown you in terms of sea level rise across the different scenarios and socioeconomic scenarios. What you see in this picture is a map in which the green areas represent those areas where for all combinations of sea level rise scenarios and socioeconomic scenarios, we have a positive benefit cost ratio for adaptation. And those areas that are in red are those areas in which adaptation has a positive benefit cost ratio in none of the scenarios. And so what the message is here, if you can see on the map, the green areas generally correspond to those densely populated areas, urban areas, populated floodplains, deltas. And the point here is that across all sea level rise scenarios and socioeconomic scenarios, it makes economic sense to adapt and to invest in adaptation, because we have a positive benefit cost ratio for across all scenarios. And that green area actually represents 13% of the global coastline, but interestingly, it represents also 90% of global coastal population and 96% of global assets situated in the 1 in 100-year floodplain. So there's a strong argument for many of the, for the vast majority of assets located in the global floodplain to invest in adaptation. For sparsely populated areas, about 65% of the world's coastline, you see these red areas where other measures would need to be considered. And for 22 of the remaining coastline, optimal adaptation strategy actually varies across different scenarios. And that represents a challenge for decision making and the need to consider flexible options that can buy time while more information about sea level rise becomes available. So if you move to the final slide, so what are the takeaways from this global analysis? Well, first of all, clearly adaptation in the majority of cases is a local decision for local coastal planners. But what this analysis show is that there's a strong economic rationale for thinking about adaptation now and taking action now, while accounting for the timing of specific measures and flexibility. And it also shows from a global perspective that that indeed adaptation makes economic sense for a large share of coastal population assets, but it raises challenges. One of those is the financing of adaptation to meet these large upfront costs, and particularly because adaptation is generally public goods, and so financing these is a challenge. And the second issue is the distributional issue, where what we see from the global picture is there's areas where it will be relatively easy to make a strong case for adaptation, and others where the case is more difficult, and we need to think about mechanisms where efficient adaptation can be undertaken, and we can ensure that those areas that are densely populated but in which less assets are located also receive sufficient financing to adapt. I think that's what I want to say. I'll now pass it back to Lisa.
Thank you, Sandy. So against that landscape, we wanted to understand how OECD countries are addressing coastal risks related to climate change. Well, in most OECD countries, the implementation of adaptation measures happens at the local level, so protect, accommodate, and retreat. The national government sets the enabling environment for this action. So we did a scan of adaptation plans and strategies, as well as looked at the recent literature on management of coastal risks, and as we said, did country interviews as well. And we looked at 3 key areas of national intervention. So we looked at information provision, which is both information on impacts and vulnerabilities, such as flood risk maps that account for sea level rise, as well as national guidance on adaptation options. We looked at regulatory and economic instruments. So this includes things like land use planning regulation that accounts for sea level rise, infrastructure standards, as well as incentive measures such as risk-based flood insurance. And finally, we looked at dedicated national funding, so funding set aside for coastal adaptation. And what we found was, while many countries are investing quite a bit in information and communication, far less have regulatory frameworks in place that account for sea level rise, and even less have dedicated national funding. For the next few slides, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on what countries are doing in each of these areas. But the report that's released today has a high level of detail on all of these, as well as a section on monitoring and evaluation of coastal risks, which I won't get into today. So looking first at information. So many countries have their own downscale climate projections, as well as coastal hazard maps, but the level of detail and the granularity of this varies greatly. And many countries also have a form of coastal adaptation guidance for local governments. So for example, Australia has the Coast Adapt platform, which is an interactive website that leads through risk assessments, decision-making under uncertainty, and looks at how to balance different interests and different options. However, many gaps do remain. For example, many countries don't have vulnerability assessments, so they don't have comprehensive assessments what's actually in the way of coastal hazards, including the age of assets and the socioeconomic characteristics of populations. In terms of regulation, as I had said earlier, limiting development in at-risk areas is the first line of defense. And some countries such as the UK, Netherlands, France, and Denmark have incorporated sea level rise margins into their land use planning and regulation. So in the Netherlands, there's designated coastal areas where you can't build, as well as designated coastal areas that need to be stayed to hold water if a flood event does happen. Other countries are integrating sea level rise into their infrastructure standards. So for example, Germany has widened the average of the crests of their dikes to account for uncertainty for sea level rise. However, a gap that remains is economic instruments. So in theory, there's a lot of interest in using risk-based flood insurance as an incentive for adaptation, but in practice, it's something that's rarely used and hasn't been used effectively yet. And finally, for dedicated funding, very few countries have dedicated funding for coastal adaptation in place. And a common misalignment that arises is national funding that targets one type of adaptation measure. So for example, funding that's available for protection then means that it encourages this one measure to be used over other measures. And this happens quite a bit after a disaster event occurs and funding is available to build back in the same way instead of to use different measures. So I just went through what countries are doing at the national level, but we also wanted to understand how does this enabling environment influence local implementation? So what are the success factors and what are the barriers for local areas actually implementing adaptation? And on this point, we looked at 4 different case studies, and we actually all our case studies are lower density areas. And that's related to Sandy's point earlier on the map, that areas where it's less cost effective to continue protection, it actually means it's more challenging to adapt, as well as there's more options that can be explored. So we looked at North Norfolk in United Kingdom, which piloted an innovative funding mechanism to move 9 properties back from the coast. We looked at Truro in Nova Scotia, Canada, which did a salt marsh restoration instead of reinforcing a dike. We looked at the funding arrangements for protection in Schleswig-Holstein in Germany. And finally, in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, we looked at a plan that involved community engagement and planned out how to respond to coastal risks from now until year 2100. So I'm just going to focus on Truro for time, but talking through Truro will take us through some of the common challenges that we saw in all the cases. So Truro is a small town on the east coast of Canada. It's highly vulnerable to storm surge related flooding and has already experienced quite a few coastal floods. So the picture you see there is from a major coastal flood in Truro. And if you look on the map, it's not on the map, but it's quite near Halifax, which, if you can see, is a place that's going to be experiencing a fair bit of sea level rise. So in the past, the focus in Nova Scotia has been on hard protection, so there's around 240 kilometers of existing coastal dikes. The issue is that much of this infrastructure needs to be reinforced or upgraded to meet new sea level rise specifications, and the financial and engineering requirements to do this exceed the current capacity. So the solution that they're working on in Truro is to remove part of an existing dike, so that's the area in light gray, and the area that we're moving is outlined in white, and to allow the land behind it, which is privately owned agricultural land, to flood, so that's in blue, and return to a salt marsh. And then they're building a new shorter dike, which is that line in black. And the idea around doing this is it's cheaper than reinforcing the dikes, it has co-benefits in terms of habitat creation, it's cost less to maintain in the long run. So there's various benefits for doing something like this, but it is a little bit innovative. As I said, it involves flooding private land. It's also going against the status quo of what's usually done in this area, which kind of brings me to the common challenges. So one, there's a challenge that we saw across the case studies in terms of information and engagement. So there's a strong citizen preference for government intervention with hard options for the status quo. So in general, as we said, coastal protection is usually funded by the government. Individuals expect that this is going to continue into the future. There's also issues around alignment, which is to say coastal jurisdictions are very crowded spaces. Responsibilities for coastal protection, for habitat restoration can be spread across different ministries and levels of government, which can make it quite difficult to come to a decision. And finally, funding. So for a project like this, but actually for all of our case studies, there's often unavailable or unclear sources of funding for coastal adaptation. And something actually Important to note for this case, as I said, the land was privately held, but it was agricultural land. There was no houses. So in terms of challenges that came up, when we're talking about flooding land where people actually have their homes, there's even more challenges involved. So what leads to successful adaptation? So looking at these 4 points draw from our case studies in terms of what were factors across these case studies that made adaptation possible and successful. And one is engage stakeholders early and substantively. So in the Canadian case that I just talked about, a special body of affected stakeholders was created and they had a vote in what happened. And this turned into a process where different experts came in to answer the concerns. So in this specific case, one of the big issues was around mosquitoes. I mean, there's a reason that we've paved over a lot of marshes. And a way of dealing with this was bringing in mosquito experts to come talk, have long conversations, figure out a mitigation plan. So things that you don't always think of tend to come up, and engaging stakeholders early and substantively and giving them power in this process is really important. Another key point is planning for the future and preventing lock-in to unsustainable pathways. So they said in New Zealand, they made a plan out to year 2100. And what this actually looks like is they identified different decision points. So for example, if flooding water comes up this far, then we'll do this. If it doesn't, then we'll do this. And this way, they knew what they wanted to do and had a sense of what the coast would look like in the future, but they weren't going to start any projects before they had to, and it left them space to change course if there's a radically different outcome. Another important point is to align actors' responsibilities, resources, and incentives. And this is a bit trickier, and it's not always in place, but Germany actually provides a really good example. So while the central government is responsible for deciding how much money is allocated each year for coastal protection, decisions on where the money will be allocated is made collectively with all the states. So all the states have to come to a decision together. And finally, explicitly consider distributional and equity implications of policies. So if you're thinking about shifting responsibility to those who are directly responsible for things, resources obviously need to be shifted with it. So you can't give responsibility to coastal adaptation to someone who doesn't have the ability to do anything about it. And an example of this and how to get here is what I said earlier about information and vulnerability assessments. So countries should have a good idea of not just what is in the way of water, but what is the ability of those who are in the way of the water to do something about it. And an example here would be in the UK, the funding model for allocating money for coastal protection is called partnership funding. And the funding decisions and how much money each local area gets depends on the socioeconomic capacities of that area. So so cities that are wealthier will get less central money for protection and accordingly. So finally, what are some key takeaways for national governments from all this? So one is that impacts are going to get worse. So the political and economic challenges we're already seeing are expected to intensify. So we can see these case studies where things are already being implemented in a way as canaries in the coal mine. This isn't kind of one-off things, but we're going to see more coastal flooding and challenges that come out from that. Relating to Sandy's points, the economic case for coastal adaptation is strong, so even in the context of uncertainty. So while there is a lot of uncertainty around the scale and pace of change, even looking across all scenarios, we still know that it's economically robust to do something about coastal risks. Another point is that incentives set by national governments can constrain local action. So even in places where it's local areas that are implementing change, policies that might not necessarily have anything to do with coastal adaptation, such as allocating funding after a disaster, public insurance schemes, can actually constrain or direct action in a way that might not be intended. And finally, and maybe the most important, the focus at the national level in OECD countries is currently on information provision, which is very important and necessary, but there's a strong need to establish frameworks, whether financial or regulatory, that set out who is responsible for what, who pays for what, and when. And this is necessary to clarify expectations as well as create incentives for all actors, so individuals, businesses, different levels of government, to take action and to manage coastal risks. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Sandy, for your presentation of the key findings from the report. So now the floor and the internet is open for questions. We've got some questions rolling in from viewers online, but first we might just see if there's any particular questions from within the room. Anyone want to volunteer to go first? Well, Waleed, please.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I was wondering actually regarding the trend of this rising seas, where the impact will be very important in emerging and developing countries. What we can learn from your report, which is based on OECD approach for those countries?
Thank you. I mean, so that's a really good question, is obviously the focus and the scope of this report was looking at what OECD countries are currently doing, but the modeling is looking at global impacts. So, I mean, there's obviously many things that are different in terms of both vulnerabilities as well as existing institutional frameworks, but we can also look at OECD countries as early adopters and learn from many of their practices. So, for example, not that we take it for granted, but the types of information frameworks that are in place and the flood risk maps and the way that sea level rise information is used in information decisions is extremely important, and I think a lesson that can be universally applied, as well as in terms of the importance of communicating risks in terms of planning for long term. Again, I think these can all be applied in a much broader than OECD country context. Thank you.
We take a question from online from Gilles Bisaro, who got a couple of very good questions here. The first one is, my understanding is that sea level rise will not be homogeneous worldwide. Sea level may even be lower in some areas. Are these geographical variations taken into account?
Thank you for the question. So I'm going to start, and then I might pass to Sandy if he has any additional points about the modeling, but we did use mean global sea level rise for this report, so which would be the average sea level rise. But the point is correct that relative sea level rise can be very different from mean sea level rise. So some places, such as parts of Sweden, land's actually rising faster than seas are rising. They won't experience the same risks. But another kind of important point is in some places, land is dropping faster than seas are rising. So in areas of Indonesia, for example, extracting groundwater is causing the land to drop quicker than seas are rising. So while mean sea level rise gives you an entry point into the conversation and a good way of looking at the overall picture, for actual decision making, relative sea level rise is much more important.
Sandy, did you want to jump in on that? I mean, I would just echo what Lisa said. I mean, certainly, and we try to emphasize that in the report. I mean, we've clearly regional and local relative sea level is going to be an important factor. Any place where you're trying to make a decision about coastal infrastructure around the globe, the mean sea level that we've used in the global analysis does give this global aggregate picture about the economics of investing in adaptation. But for local decisions, extreme value statistics as well as monitoring local level processes is essential for designing solutions. Yeah.
Thanks, Sandy. We might take another question from online, and then we'll take one from the room. But just from Tony Zamparuti, a question about the case studies. What triggered action in the case studies? Was it expert assessments of the future, or was it reactions to tragic events?
So, I mean, unfortunately, the answer is often existing cases of flooding. So in all of our cases that we picked, the ones that are actually quite ahead of the curve in terms of having implemented something, it's because they got to a point where generally it's frequent nuisance flooding. It's happening so much that it makes sense that something has to change. With that said, there was lots of other pieces in place that led to action in these places. So for example, in Canada, they had a really good sea level rise assessment. So when they had frequent flooding happening and they're thinking about what to do about it, it wasn't let's just implement traditional flood management. It was, okay, we have this baseline. We know that we're going to experience future change. How do we incorporate this into our general flood management strategy? But in terms of, and actually another thing that can precipitate action, which is the case in New Zealand, is community-led. So I think as I started with the picture of the kind of bumpy seawall in New Zealand, So in this case, it was actually a community that came together and really initiated that they wanted to do some kind of long-term planning for this issue.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I would just also jump in. I mean, in terms of the,
Sandy, please.
The situation. Yes, thank you. I think I'm audible. I mean, certainly, major flooding events are a trigger, and we see that also in Germany and most of the countries around the North Sea, with major flooding happening in the 1960s and major infrastructure reaction. Sorry about that. To that, but I think also, I mean, a key point is that what you see in Schleswig-Holstein is also the kind of process triggered by national adaptation planning has pushed the idea of financing additional measures or making available additional financing instruments for coastal adaptation, has pushed that forward. And you see that the kind of risk assessment and then also the national adaptation planning process within or initiated at the national level also has played a role, with Germany already having in place financing for adaptation additional to what they've already had in place for coastal protection.
Thanks, Sandy. We might come back to the issue of finance later, because that's obviously going to be one of the core issues. But we have a few questions in the room. Guillaume first.
Yes, thank you. So my question is about the market responses. So you talked a lot about, of course, that we need more response to those rising sea. Have you seen any example where the market for housing is already responding? So you have the price of housing going lower when the risks are increasing, and are you expecting that to happen more in the future? Because it seems that markets are not really efficient in that case. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So there's been quite a few recent studies that are looking at market responses to sea level rise risk. And generally what it finds is that as sea level rise risk gradually increases, the benefits of living near the coast, so kind of the high value of having a coastal view, actually offsets the risk of sea level rise. However, when a flood event happens, then obviously property value tends to drop off. So I think what we could be seeing is that we're building up a hidden risk in terms of risks are gradually increasing. Property values are not gradually changing to reflect this risk, but then when an event does happen, you have a drop. What's also interesting, though, is oftentimes after an event happens, you have a drop, but people's or markets' memories are maybe not as long as they could be, and we often see that prices then go back up to sometimes exactly where they were before the event. Yeah.
I mean, I'd also add here that I think, this is a clear case where policy plays a very important role. I mean, if you look at the situation in the US, as Lisa said, I mean, what you do see on the East Coast is that property prices generally react post-event, but you also see similar order of magnitude changes in property prices in reaction to changes in risk zoning associated with insurance regulations. So I think, clearly there's the risk that markets don't efficiently deal with these long-term risks of sea level rise, but there are also some available policy levers to address these things.
Thanks, Andy. Another question from inside the room. If you could identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Stefan Rees. I'm a house owner in the Netherlands, which is already below sea level, so particularly interested in the topic, and thank you for this presentation. I have a question on the distributional impact that you mentioned as something to take into account. I wondered if you could say a bit more on how you look at that. I mean, in terms of what level of distribution effects you look at, and also what kind of policies you could imagine taking place there. I mean, in the Netherlands at the moment, I think there's large discussion on mitigation policies and their distributional impact, who's going to pay for them. There's, I believe, a rather strong support across the board for the adaptation side in there. So I could imagine that the political economy underneath will depend, differ by country as well, but is different there. So the distributional aspect I find particularly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important issue, and certainly the Netherlands is probably, in terms of adaptation and if you want, sharing the burden of coastal risk at a country level, one of the more, if not most advanced countries in that sense. I mean, the tax mechanisms represented by the water boards redistribute and basically pay into a national pool for funding adaptation or funding coastal protection and coastal measures at a level that's that's world leading. And I think that's, I mean, it takes a long time to get those kind of institutions in place. I mean, there's a very long history there with the water boards and those institutions going back centuries. I think, nonetheless, there's some lessons to be learned there, and there's also other examples where distributional issues are taken account. Lisa mentioned, in terms of the case studies, the example of the UK partnership funding, where the national pool for flood measures to combat flood risk projects are weighted based on the socioeconomic status of the households that will benefit, where poorer households get a stronger weighting and a larger share of the national pool money. And I think that's an important point in the context of those global aggregate numbers that I've shown, because areas where there's a lot of assets and wealth already in the coastal floodplain, these are areas where financing adaptation will be relatively easy, and with real estate prices and so on, and possibly nature-based solutions as well. In some cases, there's a possibility to generate revenue streams and finance these things. And I think it's more difficult in areas where asset prices are not as high, and so the national level has an important role to play in ensuring that populations and households are weighted equally, and that these distributional aspects are then addressed.
I mean, just to quickly pick up on that point in terms of high value assets tending to make a better case for protection, I mean, something we have to be careful about if we're doing strict cost benefit analysis in terms of what type of adaptation measures to do. You don't want to end up in a situation where wealthier areas, it then makes sense to continue to invest in protection, in other areas it doesn't make sense. Also, in terms of distributional impacts, I mean, personally, I think that there's quite a few challenges that we're going to see soon that have not yet been worked out yet, in terms of what I was saying about the who pays for what and when. So, for example, in areas that have subsidized public flood insurance, there's been lots of pushback against reforming that flood insurance so that flood premiums actually reflect the true cost of risk, because it means that certain individuals will suddenly be paying a huge amount more than they originally were planning to. But then how do you account for, should they have known about the risk? Whose responsibility is it? And at what point is it, again, at what point is it whose responsibility? And I think that this is things that we really need more research and thought and policy action on, because it's something that's going to continually persist.
So the questions are flooding in on the WebEx, no pun intended. But one question that really does go to the heart of your modelling, Sandy, is you've mentioned a lot about the assets at risk and the wealth impacts of rising sea levels. Have you got numbers in there of people displaced? What's the amount of the population at risk?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, in the studies that we've done for this particular report, we've not looked at the question of migration in particular. So we have work ongoing on that, and there's different ways to address that. So we have some econometric work that's starting looking at decisions about migration out of the floodplain. But what we have in the report is actually numbers on people exposed to to flooding at different levels of risk. So within the 1 in 50 floodplain, 1 in 100 year floodplain. And there, I mean, I think the number that I gave in terms of the map of showing the robustness of different measures across different sea level rise scenarios. The point there is that 96% of global population lives in floodplain where it makes economic sense to invest. So there is overlap there in terms of assets as risks as well as people. But as Lisa just said, that's not the case everywhere, and so this needs to be very explicit that cost-benefit analysis is not the only decision criteria for adaptation. But certainly it makes a strong case and for protecting, and which does account for a vast majority of people living in the floodplain.
Thanks, Sandy. And for those online, keep the questions coming in. We've still got a bit of time for some more, but we'll take a question from the room now.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for a very interesting study. One question I had throughout the presentation, and I guess, you know, it's going to be many people that will have the same question, is whether in your modeling work you take into account the wider effects from the investments you do for adaptation, and how this would affect the discussion for adapting versus mitigating, if that could have an effect on that. Thank you very much.
So who wants to tackle that one? Sandy, you going first?
I mean, if I may, is that
Please,
all right?
Please go ahead.
So, I mean, yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, at least, the question is basically about whether we can account for the indirect or macroeconomic effects of adaptation investments. And I mean, there's many channels through which those indirect impacts can take place. You know, through recovery time, but also supply chains in different businesses. I mean, the short answer is no, we've not accounted for that in this study. Again, I mean, I'm happy to hear that there's interest in that. Certainly, that's something that we are currently working on. Also, to look at the question of the interdependence of different flood events and where flooding event in adjacent regions could have greater impacts. I mean, I think this is another dimension that we don't understand very well in terms of the magnitude of potential benefits from adaptation. So yes, I think there's a lot more to be uncovered in terms of the magnitude of the problem.
Thanks a lot, Sandy. We've also have a number of questions flowing in around the finance and insurance question. One is, what's the role of private finance here? What's the scope of private finance, particularly in those more densely populated areas? You've focused very much your report on the less densely populated coastlines, but flooding impacts, sea level rise impacts will be quite intense in more densely populated areas. What's the role for private finance there? And secondly, kind of related, is what's the role of insurance companies? Insurance companies in climate mitigation generally have been right at the forefront of thinking about risk. Have they really taken sea level rise under their wings, and are they paying serious attention to this? So you go first, Lisa.
So I can start on the private finance question, which is a really good question, especially looking at Sandy's model in terms of what the future costs of investing in adaptation will be. So kind of speaking on what we're seeing now, which is in general, coastal adaptation is paid for out of public finance. And the reason is that, I mean, they're generally public good investments, so they're protecting a wide range of people and assets. But it's also really difficult to monetize the benefit of coastal adaptation investments. So the benefit of a coastal adaptation investment is you're stopping future damages from occurring. So how do you actually capture that benefit, and how do you monetize that for private sector beneficiaries to pay for it? So one area that's promising in terms of private sector finance for coastal adaptation is adaptation measures that have multiple benefits. So for example, nature-based solutions that preserve amenity value or tourism value could be something that's more promising for the private sector to invest in because they have a direct benefit that they can see. And there's starting to be examples of this, and this actually links to future OECD work, which is looking at the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions and how that can be connected to different finance models. In terms of insurance companies, so this is, I mean, it's a complicated relationship. And one thing I can say is that while there's quite a bit of interest and excitement around insurance companies stepping up and incentivizing individuals to know their level of risk, this hasn't actually worked out that well for coastal adaptation. And that's because, first of all, many countries, coastal flood risk isn't covered by insurance. So for example, overland flooding, it's much easier to insure river flooding, but coastal flooding is a bit of a different creature. In addition, in terms of insurance companies being risk-based and accounting for sea level rise and incentivizing individual action, there's not a very good understanding of what individual measures could actually work against getting a premium discount for coastal adaptation. With that said, insurance is quite involved in terms of lobbying governments, helping with risk maps, creating generally improving information, raising the importance of the issue, but in terms of kind of direct impact or directly providing money for public good adaptation measures, that's not something we're seeing. Sandy, I think you might want to add on both those points.
Yeah, if I may add on the private finance point, I mean, I completely agree with what was said about the need for multiple benefits as a means to harness revenue streams that it can bring in private finance and help to overcome the financing challenge. I think I would add one other example, a bit different than the kind of nature-based solution, and that's something that we see also already occurring around the world, particularly in dense urban areas where nature-based solutions may be more difficult to implement, and that's land reclamation that actually can generate revenues through the creation of new land and the property values associated with that. I mean, that option, that measure you see occurring now in the small island states, and it is an option that doesn't come without risks. Clearly, there's potential environmental impacts, but I think that also in the context of developing countries where government funds for public goods are more scarce in a capital constrained world, these options can be something that can harness private finance and lead to greater adaptation, and are something that should be approached carefully, but that offers some potential.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last question coming from online, and it's from Harkin Trop, who is actually at the OECD, so he must be watching this from his desk. So his question is, how does the report relate to the role of existing institutions for response options? There is great institutional fragmentation, both across sectors and geographies, with few regional platforms for policy and stakeholder coordination, both within and between countries. How does this fragmentation really being reflected in the insights that you've gained?
Well, I mean, something that came out in the case studies is like fragmented governance in terms of responsibility for coastal risk is something that, I mean, quite obviously slows down adaptation. And I mean, something that is generally a challenge around coastal adaptation is adaptation plans and policies are often the responsibility of ministries of environment, but they're planning documents. So if there's no funding attached and there's no clear implementing agencies and monitoring and evaluating frameworks linked with this, you're not going to get anywhere with your adaptation. As well as coastal adaptation is tricky because a lot of these measures are things that we already do in response to other issues. So it's really about how do we bring sea level rise considerations and this idea that we have a lot of uncertainty about risk, but we know that we're going to be facing steadily increasing risk way into the future. How do we bring this into other policy fields that are kind of doing their thing that they've always been doing in a certain way?
Sandy, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's...
Okay, great. So my final question to you, Lisa, is you're in charge of all this work. What's next on the agenda?
So as I hinted at earlier, something that came out of this work was a really strong interest from governments in nature-based solutions in terms of barriers to implementation, as well as the opportunities around them as investment potential and as potential to mobilize different sources of finance. So our next project, while it isn't specifically coastal focused, it's going to be looking at mobilizing finance for nature-based solutions.
And we look forward to that, and we'll have you back for another Green Talk Live at that time. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining online, and thank you everyone in the room for your engagement and your questions. And thanks most of all to Sandy from Berlin or Hamburg. I'm not quite sure which city you're in, but the technology worked to bring you into the room. Thank you very much for joining us, and to Lisa. And congratulations to you both on the release of the report. So thank you very much. And for those online, if you would like to keep in touch with, just stay tuned to our OECD Environment website for our next Green Talk Live. And thank you very much for joining us.